Hello dear wanderers of the mist-shrouded lands. Welcome back to our gentle corner where ancient voices whisper through the ages and the heroes of old walk beside us once more. Tonight, we journey deep into the heart of the Ulster cycle, to a time when warriors measured their worth not just in battles won, but in oaths kept and honor upheld. Our path leads us to a figure who stands in the long shadow cast by the great Conall Cernach, yet who carved his own legend into the very stones of Ireland. Tonight, we speak of Conall Cernach, whose name echoes through the halls of mythology as Conall the Victorious. He was a man born under a prophecy of bloodshed, marked from his first breath by violence, yet who became one of Ulster's greatest defenders. His story weaves through the grandest tales of the ancient kingdom, from feasting halls where champions competed for glory, to battlefields soaked in the blood of heroes, to the quiet, sorrowful end that comes to even the mightiest of warriors. So settle into your favorite space, perhaps with a warm drink close at hand. Let the concerns of the modern world fade like morning mist beneath the sun. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself transported back to a land where the boundary between the mortal and the mystical was gossamer thin, where a warrior's word was more binding than any chain, and where every hill and stream held memories of deeds both glorious and terrible. Let us walk together through the life of Conall Cernach, the second champion of Ulster, the keeper of oaths, the collector of heads, and in his final days, a tragic figure seeking an honorable death. The miraculous birth. Our tale begins not with the clash of swords or the thunder of chariot wheels, but with a quieter kind of sorrow. In the halls of Mocha, the great seat of Ulster's kings, there lived a noble couple burdened by a grief that no amount of wealth or status could ease. Imogen mac Ecet, the renowned poet whose words could move hearts and whose wisdom was sought by kings, had taken as his wife the beautiful Finchom. She was a woman of impeccable lineage, for her father was none other than Cathbad the Druid, the most powerful seer in all of Ulster, and in most tales, she was the sister of King Conchobar mac Nessa himself. But despite their love, despite their station, despite every blessing the gods might bestow, Finchom remained barren. Month after month, season after season, year after year, her womb stayed empty. In a time when a woman's worth was often measured by the sons she bore, and when a warrior's legacy lived on through his descendants, this childlessness was a wound that cut deeper than any blade. Imogen, for all his eloquence, could find no words to ease his wife's pain. Finchom, daughter of the greatest druid in Ireland, could find no magic to undo whatever curse or fate kept her from motherhood. The years stretched on, heavy with unspoken longing. Every feast where other women proudly displayed their children, every gathering where warriors boasted of their sons' first exploits, was a reminder of what they lacked. But Finchom was not one to surrender to despair. If the gods had placed this obstacle before her, then she would find a way around it. She had grown up in her father's house, after all, had breathed the air thick with incense and incantation, had heard whispered the old prayers to powers older than the Tuatha De Danann themselves. One day, when hope had worn thin but not quite broken, Finchom sought out a druid, one of those mysterious figures who walked between worlds and read the future in the flight of birds and the patterns of clouds. She approached him in his sacred grove, where ancient oaks stretched their gnarled branches toward the heavens and the air hummed with otherworldly power. The druid, whose name has been lost to time but whose wisdom has not, looked upon her with eyes that seemed to see through the very fabric of reality. "I know why you have come," he said, his voice like wind through winter branches. "Your heart aches for a child, and the years have been cruel in their denial." Finchom nodded, pride warring with desperation in her breast. The druid was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if consulting with beings beyond mortal sight. Finally, he spoke. "There is a way, but it requires payment. If my fee is good, you will bear a son for Imogen, a son who will shake the very foundations of this land." "Name your price," Finchom said without hesitation. Whatever you ask, if it is within my power to give, you shall have it." The druid smiled, a strange expression that was neither entirely kind nor entirely cruel. "Your fee will be good," he said cryptically. "Come to me tomorrow at dawn, and I will take you to a place of power." When the first light of the new day painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Finechome met the druid at the appointed place. He led her through paths that seemed to appear beneath their feet and disappear behind them, through thickets that parted at their approach, until they came to a clearing she had never seen before, though she had walked these woods since childhood. In the center of the clearing stood a well, its stones ancient beyond reckoning, covered in moss and worn smooth by countless centuries. The druid gestured toward the well. "This is a threshold place," he explained, his voice taking on a rhythmic, incantatory quality. "The waters here flow from the other world itself. They carry power, and life, and possibility." He began to chant in words older than the tongue of the gales, words that made the air shimmer and the water in the well begin to glow with a faint, silvery light. When the ritual was complete, the druid instructed her, "Wash yourself with this water, drink deeply of it, and you will bring forth a son. But know this, no child who will be born will be more terrible to his mother's family than him. He will be the scourge of the Connachta, a weapon forged in prophecy and tempered in blood." Finechome felt a shiver run through her, but she had come too far to turn back now. She cupped her hands and drew the water from the well. It was cold, impossibly cold, as if it carried with it the chill of places where no sun had ever shone. She drank deeply, feeling the liquid slide down her throat like liquid starlight. And in that water, unnoticed in her eagerness, swam a small worm, which she swallowed with the sacred draught. The change was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The water had done its work. Within weeks, Finechome knew that a child grew within her womb. The joy that flooded through her was like the breaking of a dam, washing away years of sorrow in a single, glorious moment. She told Imogen, and the poet wept for joy, his carefully crafted words failing him utterly in the face of such happiness. They told her father Cathbad, and the old druid smiled, though his eyes held shadows of futures he had foreseen. But there was one who heard the news with dread rather than delight. Cet Mac Magach, a mighty warrior of Connacht and Finechome's brother in some versions of the tale, was visiting Ulster when word reached him of his sister's pregnancy. As soon as he heard, a darkness fell over his heart, for he too was gifted with sight beyond sight, and he had heard whispered prophecies about the child his sister would bear. Cet knew, with the terrible certainty that comes from true sight, that this child would be the doom of Connacht. The druids had spoken it, the stars confirmed it, and the very earth seemed to tremble with the weight of destiny. This child would kill more than half the warriors of Connacht. This child would never spend a night without a Connachtman's head on his belt. This child would be the instrument of his people's suffering. And so Cet Mac Magach, fierce warrior and loving brother, made a choice that would haunt him and define the child's entire life. He would not let this prophecy come to pass. He would protect his people, his kinsmen, his warriors, even if it meant betraying the bonds of blood. He stood guard over his sister, his face a mask of brotherly concern, but his heart heavy with dark purpose. He waited, and he watched, as the months passed and his sister's belly swelled with life. When Finechome's time came, the birth was swift and relatively easy, as if the child himself was eager to enter the world and begin the work destiny had laid out for him. The druids came, as was customary, to perform the pagan rites of initiation, to name the child and to divine his future. They gathered around the infant, speaking their incantations and reading the signs. Their faces grew grave as they chanted, and when they finally spoke their prophecy aloud, their words confirmed Cet's darkest fears. "This boy," they intoned, "will be the most impious child ever born to the Connachta. He will not pass a single night without the head of a Connachtman on his belt. He will kill more than half of all the warriors of Connaught. His name will be a curse spoken in the halls of Cruachan, and his deeds will echo through the ages. The words had barely faded when Cet moved. In one swift motion, he took the infant from his mother's arms, ignoring her cries of protest. He placed the tiny form on the ground, and before anyone could stop him, he lifted his foot and brought his heel down with all his strength onto the baby's neck, attempting to break it and end the threat before it could begin. Finchom's scream tore through the air, a sound of pure maternal anguish that would haunt Cet for the rest of his days. But when the warrior lifted his foot, the infant was still alive, still breathing, though his neck was twisted and damaged. Cet had not succeeded in crushing the child's neck entirely, though he had left it permanently crooked, marked forever by his uncle's attempted murder. Finchom snatched up her injured son, cradling him against her breast, her eyes blazing with fury and grief as she looked at her brother. "Wolfish is the treachery you do, brother," she cried, her voice breaking. The Irish word she used was conda, meaning wolf-like, and fell, meaning treacherous. Cet, staring at what he had done, at the child who lived despite his attempt to end its life, felt the weight of his actions settle onto his soul. "It's true," he said quietly, the words heavy as stones. "Conall or Confhel will be his name from here on." The name was a bitter pun, playing on the words for wolf and fell treachery. And so the child who would become the great champion bore from his first hours the marks of the destiny that pursued him. His neck, permanently twisted, would forever remind the world of the prophecy that preceded him and the violence that greeted his birth. He would grow to be Conall Cernach, Conall of the crooked neck, Conall the victorious, and the prophecy spoken over his infant form would prove both blessing and curse throughout his long and storied life. The warrior's form. To understand Conall Cernach, to truly grasp the figure he cut as he walked through the halls of Emain Mocha or rode into battle, we must paint his image in our minds with the same vivid detail that the ancient storytellers used. For the Irish bards did not simply speak of a warrior's deeds, they described the man himself in loving, intricate detail, so that even those born centuries later might see him as clearly as if he stood before them. The finest description of Conall comes to us from an ancient tale called The Destruction of D.A. Durga's Hostel, a story of tragedy and doom that unfolded when Conall was in the prime of his life. A witness in that tale looked upon him and was moved to describe what he saw with the precision of a master artist working in words. "I saw a man there in an ornamented dining compartment," the description begins, "who was the fairest of the warriors of Ireland." Already we see that Conall was not merely fierce or skilled, but beautiful, possessed of that quality the Irish called Elaine, a beauty that spoke of nobility and divine favour. Around his shoulders, he wore a fleecy crimson cloak, the colour of blood and royalty, the kind of garment that announced its wearer's status long before any words were spoken. But it was his face that truly arrested the eye, for it bore a peculiarity that made him instantly recognizable across any distance. One of his cheeks was as white as fresh-fallen snow, pure and pale, while the other was freckled and red like the foxglove flower that grows in Ireland's woodlands. It was as if two men had been merged into one, or as if he stood perpetually at the threshold between two worlds. His eyes continued this theme of duality and contrast. One eye was blue as a hyacinth, that delicate flower whose color captures the very essence of the sky on a perfect spring day. But the other eye was as black as a beetle's back, dark and gleaming, holding depths that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Those who met his gaze often felt disoriented, unsure which eye to focus on, as if Conall could see into two different realities simultaneously. But perhaps most striking of all was his hair. It was fair and very blonde, so light it seemed to capture and hold the sun's rays. And there was so much of it, bushy and thick like a tufted ram's wool. It cascaded down his back, striking the edge of his hips in a golden waterfall. The ancient description tells us that if someone had poured a sack of red nuts over his head, Not a single nut would have fallen to the ground, so dense and voluminous was that magnificent manner. In his hand, he carried a sword with a hilt of gold, a weapon that had drunk the blood of countless foes and would drink more before its work was done. His shield was blood red, studded with rivets of white metal between plates of gold, a defense that was both practical and beautiful, worthy of a champion of Ulster. And his spear, his spear was a fearsome thing, long and three-ridged, with a shaft as thick as an outer yoke on a miller's team. It was the kind of weapon that could pierce through both shield and the man behind it, that could pin a charging warrior to the earth or pluck a horseman from his saddle. This was Conall Cernach in his glory days, a figure of contradiction and harmony, beautiful and terrible, marked by his uncle's violence yet radiating nobility. His crooked neck, which one might expect to be a disfigurement, somehow only added to his distinctive appearance. It was a badge of the prophecy he carried, a reminder that he had survived what was meant to kill him, that destiny itself had marked him for great deeds. As Conall grew from infant to boy, from boy to youth, and from youth to man, he was raised in the household of his father Imogen and his mother Finechome. But like many noble children of Ulster, his fosterage was shared among several worthy households, each contributing something essential to the making of a hero. Alongside him grew his foster brother and cousin, a boy named Setanta who would one day take the name Conall Cernach, the Hound of Culan, and become the greatest warrior Ireland would ever know. The bond between Conall and Conall Cernach was forged in childhood and would endure until death and beyond. They trained together, learned the arts of war together, competed with one another in the way that young warriors do, each pushing the other to greater heights. But where Conall Cernach would become known for his supernatural battle frenzy, his otherworldly father Luff, and his role as Ulster's sole defender, Conall would be known for something different, for his steadfastness, his honour, his grim determination, and his absolute refusal to forget a wrong done to Ulster or to those he loved. As Conall reached manhood, he took his place among the Red Branch, that brotherhood of warriors who served Ulster and King Conchobar mac Nessa. He became known for his skill in combat, but also for a particular and gruesome practice that would define much of his legend. True to the prophecy spoken at his birth, Conall Cernach never spent a night without the head of a Connachtman under his knee. This was not merely a saying or an exaggeration. The ancient texts tell us repeatedly that Conall collected the heads of his enemies, preserving them as trophies, displaying them as warnings, using them as reminders of oaths kept and vengeance delivered. The practice of taking heads was not unusual among the ancient Celts. Classical authors wrote of how Celtic warriors would decapitate their enemies and hang the heads from their horses or mount them on poles. But even in that culture of head-taking, Conall Cernach stood out for the sheer dedication with which he pursued this practice. Each head represented not just a victory in battle, but a piece of the destiny that had been carved into his very name at birth. He was to be the doom of Connacht, and every Connachtman's head he took was another line in the story that fate had written for him. The feast of Mac Da Thos Pig. There came a time in the endless rivalry between Ulster and Connacht when that conflict would be crystallized in a single, extraordinary evening. It was an event that would showcase everything that made Conall Cernach both great and complex: his pride, his skill with words as well as weapons, his bitter feud with his uncle, and his absolute determination never to be bested, especially not by a man of Connacht. The tale begins with Mac Da Thos, a wealthy hospitaller of Leinster, caught in a dilemma that would have strained the wisdom of Solomon himself. Mac Da Thos possessed two treasures that had caught the attention of Ireland's greatest powers. The first was an enormous pig, an animal so massive that it had required 60 milch cows just to nourish it, and had grown so large that 40 oxen had to be laid across it to properly display its size. The second treasure was a magnificent hound named Ailbe, a dog so fierce and loyal that it alone could protect all of Mac Da Thos' extensive territories. Both King Conchobar mac Nessa of Ulster and Queen Maeve along with her husband Ailill of Connaught sent messengers to Mac Da though, each demanding the hound Ailb as a gift, each offering lavish compensation, each making it clear that refusal would mean war. Mac Da though found himself trapped. To give Ailb to Ulster would make an enemy of Connaught. To give Ailb to Connaught would make an enemy of Ulster. To refuse both would make enemies of them both. For 3 days, Mac Da though fasted, seeking wisdom in the privation of food and water, but no answer came. It was his wife, in the end, who suggested the solution, though it was a solution as dangerous as it was clever. Promise the hound to both, she said. Invite them both to a great feast. Let them fight over which shall have the dog, and whatever destruction comes, let it fall on them and not on us. And so Mac Da though sent word to both kingdoms that yes, they could have the hound Ailb, and yes, they should come to a great feast to celebrate the gift. He ordered his enormous pig slaughtered and prepared, and he opened his famous hostel, a place of legend in its own right. This hostel had 7 doors for its 7 entrances, and in its center burned 7 hearths, and over each hearth hung a cauldron. These were no ordinary cauldrons, but magical vessels. When a person passed by and thrust their fork into the cauldron, whatever they pulled out was what they would eat that night. One chance only, no second servings, no exchanges. The warriors of Ulster and the warriors of Connaught arrived on the same day, each group surprised but not entirely shocked to see the other. Mac Da though greeted them with expansive hospitality, pretending amazement at the coincidence, and invited both armies to sit down to the feast together. The great pig was brought in, and immediately, the question arose, who would carve it? Who would claim the champion's portion, the curadmere, that choice cut of meat reserved for the greatest warrior present? This was no mere matter of food. The champion's portion was a declaration of status, of preeminence, of the right to be recognized as the finest warrior in the hall. Ancient Greek and Roman writers had described this Celtic custom with fascination, noting that disputes over the champion's portion sometimes ended in single combat to the death right there at the feast. The stakes could not have been higher, and every warrior present knew it. It was agreed that those who wished to claim the champion's portion should stand and declare their deeds, letting their actions speak for them. And so began a competition of boasting, each warrior rising to recount his greatest victories, his most famous kills, his most impressive feats of arms. One by one, the warriors of Ulster stood and made their claims, each believing he had earned the right to carve the pig. And one by one, Cet Mac Magach of Connaught, that same Cet who had tried to kill his nephew in infancy, stood and tore apart their claims. His words were sharp as any blade, and he wielded them with devastating effect. To each Ulster warrior, Cet had a response, a memory of a time when he had bested them in combat, when he had humiliated them, when he had left them marked or maimed. When one warrior stood, Cet reminded him of the day Cet had emasculated him with a spear thrust. When another claimed his right, Cet recalled the time he had left that man crawling in the dirt. The Ulster champions sat down one after another, their boasts turned to ashes in their mouths by Cet's merciless recitation of their defeats. Finally, with no Ulster warrior left standing, Cet Mac Magach himself approached the pig, knife in hand, ready to claim victory not just for himself but for all of Connaught. The men of Ulster sat in humiliated silence, and the men of Connaught began to cheer, sensing triumph. Cet's hand was on the pig, the blade was at the flesh, and the moment of glory had arrived. Then the doors burst open. Conall Cernach strode into the hall, and a wave of relief swept through the Ulster warriors like wind through wheat. Here at last was a champion who might stand against Cet. Here was the man who never spent a night without a Connachtman's head under his knee. Here was the nephew facing the uncle who had tried to murder him. Here was prophecy and destiny colliding in a single, electric moment. "It's good to see you," Conall said to Cet, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall, that a Connachtman should have the champion's portion to divide at a feast. But it was always our custom, Cet, that the champion of Ulster should divide it. Cet straightened slowly, knife still in hand, and looked at his nephew across the length of the hall. I accept that it is you, Conall, he said carefully. Your mother is my sister, and I acknowledge your skill. But if Amlwan, my brother, were here, he would give you another contest for the champion's portion. His absence is Ulster's good fortune. The words had barely left Cet's mouth when Conall reached into his leather bag and drew forth something that made the entire hall gasp. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed onto the table in front of Cet the freshly severed head of Amlwan. He is here, Conall said simply, and he contests nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the hall was fixed on that head, on its glassy eyes and slack features, on the blood still fresh enough to gleam in the firelight. It was a statement as clear as any words could be. Conall had not just killed Cet's brother. He had killed him recently, perhaps even on his way to this very feast, and had carried the head with him as a casual trophy. Cet Mac Magach, warrior of Connacht, champion of his people, the man who had just humiliated every Ulster warrior present, looked at his brother's head and then at his nephew's face. And for once, he had no words. He stepped back from the pig. Conall Cernach stepped forward and began to carve, giving the choice portions to the men of Ulster. And as he carved, the tension in the hall grew like a storm building on the horizon. The warriors of Connacht, humiliated by this reversal, began to mutter among themselves. Hands moved to weapons. Glances were exchanged. The feast was about to become a battlefield. And so it did. The fighting began as a flood begins, first a trickle of insults, then a rush of shoving, and finally a torrent of violence as warriors fell upon each other with swords and spears and fists. Mac Da's great hostel became a slaughterhouse, with blood mixing with spilled mead on the floor and the screams of the dying echoing from the rafters. The war between Ulster and Connacht had found a new battleground, and Conall Cernach, having ignited it with a single, brutally honest gesture, fought in the thick of it, his sword rising and falling, adding more Connacht heads to his tally. The battle finally spilled out of the hostel entirely, turning into a running fight that spread across the countryside. Mac Da's hound Aelb, the prize that had started all this, sided with the men of Ulster and helped harry the retreating Connacht forces. But in the chaos of retreat, Aelb was killed by a Connacht charioteer, dying far from home for a cause that had never truly been about him. For Conall Cernach, the feast had been a triumph. He had vindicated Ulster's honour, proven his superiority over his uncle, displayed his grim trophy in a way that no one would ever forget, and lived up to both his name, the Victorious, and the prophecy that hung over his life like a dark blessing. It was one of those moments when everything that made him great and terrible and complicated came together in a perfect, bloody storm. The competition at Brickrew's feast. If the feast at Mac Da's had revealed Conall Cernach at his most triumphant, then the feast held by Brickrew Mac Carbada would show him in a different light. Still proud, still skilled, but ultimately unable to match the one warrior who was destined to stand above all others. It is a tale that reminds us that even great champions must sometimes bow to those who are greater still. Brickrew of the Poisoned Tongue, as he was known, was one of those figures who seemed to exist solely to cause trouble. He was a warrior himself, skilled enough to demand respect, but his true gift was for mischief, for finding the sore spots in others' pride and pressing on them until violence erupted. He took delight in setting people against each other, in watching friendships shatter and feuds ignite. The Ulster men knew his nature well and generally avoided accepting his invitations, for to enter Brickrew's hall was to enter a trap. But Brickrew was clever, and he knew how to manipulate pride. He built a magnificent new hostel at Dunrudrage and spent a full year preparing a feast so lavish so extraordinary, that to refuse it would be an insult no warrior could bear. He personally went to King Conall mac Nessa and the heroes of Ulster and extended his invitation with honeyed words, making it clear that all of Ulster would be shamed if they failed to attend. And so they agreed, though with reluctance, and the warriors and their families made their way to Bricrew's new hall. But Bricrew had already set his trap. Before the feast, he went separately to 3 of Ulster's greatest champions, speaking to each in secret, flattering each with exquisite precision, and promising each the champion's portion at the coming feast. First, he went to Conall Cernach, stroking his pride with reminders of his victories, his unmatched skill, his superiority over so many. "Surely," Bricrew said, "surely you deserve the champion's portion more than any other. It is your right, and I will ensure you receive it." Then he went to Logair Buadak, called Logair the Triumphant, and spoke the same words with the same conviction, as if Logair were the only champion worthy of the honor. Finally, he went to Conall Cernach, young but already legendary, and made the same promise with the same apparent sincerity. 3 champions, 3 promises, 1 champion's portion. Bricrew had set his trap and baited it perfectly. When the feast began and the great pig was brought in, all seemed normal at first. But then the 3 charioteers, the drivers and companions of the 3 champions, stood up simultaneously, each claiming the champion's portion for his master. The atmosphere in the hall changed instantly, going from festive to tense in a heartbeat. Conall, Logair, and Conall Cernach all reached for their weapons, and what had been a feast threatened to become a bloodbath. King Conall, Fergus mac Roich, and Cernach the wise judge immediately intervened, separating the 3 warriors before swords could be drawn. It was decided that this dispute could not be settled there and then, that it required outside judgment. The matter would be put before neutral parties who could assess each warrior's worth and declare who truly deserved the champion's portion. But Bricrew was not done with his mischief. While the men argued, he went to the wives of the 3 champions, flattering each with the same skill he had used on their husbands. To Lendebear, Conall's wife, he promised that she would be acknowledged as the foremost woman of Ulster. To Fedelm, Logair's wife, he made the same promise. And to Emma, Conall Cernach's wife, he offered the same honor. He then suggested that whichever woman entered the feast hall first would be recognized as having precedence over all other women. The 3 women, each believing she had been promised supremacy, raced toward the hall. What began as a dignified walk quickly turned into an undignified sprint, with the wives of Ulster's greatest champions hiking up their skirts and running like deer, each desperate to be first through the door. Their husbands, seeing this humiliating display, tried to help by lifting the very walls of the hall to let their wives enter first. Conall Cernach, with his supernatural strength, succeeded in lifting his side of the hall high enough for Emma to enter first, though in doing so he tipped Bricrew himself into a ditch, much to everyone's satisfaction. But the question of the champion's portion remained unresolved. The Ulstermen decided to seek judgment from Ailill and Maeve, the King and Queen of Connaught. Despite the perpetual rivalry between the kingdoms, Ailill and Maeve were known for their hospitality and their adherence to the ancient customs. Surely they would judge fairly. The 3 champions travelled to Cruachan, the seat of Connaught's power, where Ailill and Maeve held court in their great hall. The royal couple devised a series of tests. They sent demons against the champions, and while Logair and Conall fled in terror, Conall Cernach stood his ground and fought. They sent wild cats to attack them, and again, only Conall Cernach did not retreat. In every test, Conall Cernach proved superior, and Ailill and Maeve declared him the rightful champion. But Conall and Logair refused to accept this judgment. They argued that Ailill and Maeve, as rulers of Connaught, could not be trusted to judge Ulster's warriors fairly. The dispute remained unresolved, and the 3 returned to Ulster with nothing settled. They needed another judge, one whose authority no one could question. So the matter was brought before Cuarí mac Daire, the king of Munster, a figure of immense power and wisdom, a warrior druid who walked between the mortal world and the other world with ease. Cuarí devised his own tests, and once again, Cúl Chulainn emerged superior in each one. But once again, Conall and Logair refused to accept the result. Finally, Cuarí decided on a test that would demonstrate not just martial skill, but honor, courage, and integrity, the true measure of a champion. He disguised himself as a hideous churl, a giant of a man with skin like leather and hair like tangled brambles, carrying an enormous axe. This terrifying figure appeared at Emain Mocha one evening, and issued a challenge that made the blood of the warriors run cold. "I seek a man to make a bargain with me," the churl announced, his voice like boulders grinding together. "I will allow one of you to cut off my head tonight, on the condition that I may return tomorrow night and cut off your head in turn. Is there a warrior of Ulster brave enough to accept such a bargain?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. It seemed an impossible proposition, for what man could survive having his head cut off? Yet to refuse was to admit cowardice, and no true champion of Ulster could bear that shame. Logair Buadak stepped forward first, his pride not allowing him to be outdone. "I accept your challenge," he declared. The churl knelt, placing his head on a block, and Logair swung his sword with all his might, severing the head cleanly. The head rolled across the floor, blood pooling beneath it, and the body slumped forward. But then, to everyone's horror, the body stood up, walked over to the head, picked it up, and placed it back on its shoulders. The flesh knit together, the blood stopped flowing, and the churl was whole again. "Tomorrow night, then," the churl said, and walked out of the hall, his footsteps echoing on the stones. The next night, the churl returned, axe in hand, ready to collect his due. But Logair was nowhere to be found. He had fled, his courage failing him when faced with the reality of his doom. Conall Cernach, seeing Logair's shame, stepped forward. "I will take up the challenge," he declared, determined not to show the same cowardice. Once again, the churl knelt, and once again, a champion beheaded him. And once again, the churl restored himself and departed, promising to return. But when the next night came, Conall Cernach was also absent, having fled just as Logair had. His pride had been strong enough to accept the challenge, but not strong enough to face its consequences. It was a failure that would haunt him, a mark against his honor that no amount of victories in normal combat could quite erase. Only Cúl Chulainn, when his turn came, remained true to his word. He beheaded the churl, and when the next night arrived, he knelt and placed his own neck on the block, ready to accept death with the same courage he had shown in accepting the challenge. The churl raised his axe high, and every person watching held their breath, certain they were about to witness the death of Ulster's greatest hero. But the axe did not fall. Instead, the churl smiled, and his disguise fell away, revealing Cuarí himself. "You alone have honor enough to match your skill," he said to Cúl Chulainn. "You alone were willing to face death to keep your word. The champion's portion is yours, undisputed, and let no one question it again." For Conall Cernach, this episode was a bitter moment. He had proven himself Cúl Chulainn's equal in many ways, had stood beside him in countless battles, had matched him in skill with weapons. But in this test of pure honor and courage, he had failed where his foster brother had succeeded. The champion's portion, which he had claimed triumphantly at Mac Dao's feast, was not his to claim at Bricrew's. The prophecy had marked him for greatness, but it had not marked him for supremacy. That honor belonged to another. The journey to the Alps. Not every adventure in the life of a warrior revolves around feasts and competitions. Sometimes, the measure of a hero is found in the aid he gives to others, in the lengths he will travel and the dangers he will face not for his own glory, but for friendship and honor. Such was the case when Conall Cernach embarked on one of the strangest and most far-ranging quests in all of Irish mythology, a journey that would take him from the green shores of Ireland to the snow-capped peaks of the distant Alps. The tale begins with Frecch, a hero of Connacht, known throughout Ireland for his exceptional beauty and courage. Despite the perpetual rivalry between Ulster and Connacht, there were bonds of friendship and mutual respect that could transcend provincial loyalties, and Conall and Frecch had such a bond. Perhaps it had been forged in some adventure not recorded in the surviving tales, or perhaps it was simply the recognition that one great warrior gives to another, regardless of which kingdom they serve. Frecch had travelled to the court of Queen Maeve and King Ailill in Connacht, seeking the hand of their daughter Findabair in marriage. But while he was away from his own territories, pursuing this courtship with all its complex negotiations and dangerous games, disaster struck his homeland. Raiders came in the night, and when they left, they took with them Frecch's most precious possessions, not gold or jewels, but his wife and his 3 sons, along with all his cattle. The theft was devastating in both material and emotional terms. A warrior's wealth was measured in cattle, and to lose an entire herd was to lose everything. But far worse was the loss of family. For all the violence and bloodshed of the age, for all the heads taken and the boasts made, family was sacred. A man who could not protect his wife and children had failed in his most fundamental duty. When word reached Frecch of what had been done, he was frantic with grief and rage. He immediately set out to track the raiders, following the trail of his stolen cattle and the footprints of his captured family. The trail led north and west, out of Ireland entirely, across the narrow sea to Alba, the land known today as Scotland. But the trail did not end in Alba. It continued south, through Britain, across the Channel, through the land called Lombardy, ever deeper into the continent, climbing into the mountains. The raiders, whoever they were, had taken their prizes far from any possible rescue, to a fortress in the Alps themselves, where they ruled as petty kings over a realm built on theft and violence. Frecch, alone and far from home, realized he could not hope to assault such a stronghold by himself. He needed help, needed a companion who could match his own skill in battle, someone he could trust absolutely. And so he turned to Ulster, to the warrior he knew would not refuse a call for aid. He found Conall Cernach at Benaberkai, a mountain on Ulster's southern border, where Conall happened to be keeping watch. The meeting between them was brief but filled with the kind of immediate understanding that comes between warriors who have fought beside each other before. Frecch explained his situation, the theft of his family and his cattle, the long trail that had led him so far from home, and his need for a companion to help him complete his quest. Conall listened in silence, his strange dual-coloured eyes fixed on Frecch's face. When the Connacht hero finished speaking, Conall asked a single question: "What awaits me in this venture?" "Much trouble," Frecch admitted honestly. "More than I can rightly predict. But I ask you all the same, in memory of past friendship, to come with me." Conall Cernach did not hesitate. "I shall go truly," he said simply, and began to gather his weapons and provisions for the journey. And so the 2 warriors set off on one of the strangest odysseys in Irish mythology, a journey that would take them across Europe on foot and horseback, through lands neither had ever seen before. They travelled north through Alba, then south through the breadth of Britain, crossing forests and rivers, staying in strange towns where the language was unlike anything they knew, sleeping rough when no hospitality was available. They crossed the narrow sea in a small boat, braving waters that seemed determined to swallow them, and made their way through Lombardy, following the increasingly cold trail of the raiders. The land grew mountainous, and still they climbed, into regions where snow lay even in summer, where the air grew thin and the peaks around them scraped the belly of the sky. Finally, after weeks or perhaps months of travel, they came to a high valley in the Alps. There, tending a flock of sheep, they found an unexpected sight: a young Irish girl, far from home, speaking in the tongue of their homeland. She looked up as they approached, her eyes widening with recognition not of their faces but of their nationality, their bearing, their unmistakable Irish character. "You are far from home, warriors," she said, her voice carrying the lilt of Ireland, and they could hear in it both relief at speaking her native tongue and sorrow for her own exile in this strange land. "As are you," Conall replied gently. "How came you to this place, so far from the green shores of our island?" She told them her story, of how she had been captured like so many others, brought here by the warriors who ruled this valley, who made their living raiding far and wide, stealing cattle and people and treasures, bringing them all back to their mountain fortress. She had been made a shepherdess, her life spare but not entirely cruel, better than many fates that befell captured women. Conall and Fretch explained their quest, and the girl's face lit up with hope. "Your family is here," she told Fretch. "Your wife and sons, they are kept in the fortress. And your cattle, I tend some of them myself. But you must know, the fortress is well guarded. Its walls are strong, and at its gate stands a serpent of enormous size, a guardian that has killed many who tried to approach." She advised them to seek out another woman, one who tended the cows rather than the sheep, who might help them gain access to the fortress. They thanked her and moved on, finding the cowwoman as directed. This woman, too, was sympathetic to their quest, moved perhaps by homesickness or simply by the romance of a hero come to rescue his family from captivity. "The serpent is terrible," she warned them, "but I will leave the gate open tonight, after dark. If you can somehow get past the serpent, you may be able to free the prisoners before the warriors of this place realize what is happening." As night fell, Conall and Fretch approached the fortress, weapons drawn, every sense alert. They could see the gate standing slightly ajar, as the cowwoman had promised, and they could see the serpent, a massive thing, its scales gleaming in the moonlight, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its body coiled around the gate post like a living rope. They prepared for combat, knowing that they would have to fight this creature before they could proceed. But as they stepped forward, something extraordinary happened. The serpent raised its head, its tongue flickering, tasting the air. It looked at Conall Cernach with those luminous eyes, and something passed between them, some recognition or judgment that exists beyond human understanding. Then, in a movement too quick to follow, the serpent uncoiled itself and launched through the air, not to attack, but to wrap itself around Conall's waist, where it settled like a living belt, its head resting against his hip, its tail secured around his other side. The serpent, the terrible guardian that had killed so many, had chosen Conall as its companion, as if recognizing in him some quality that commanded its loyalty. Conall stood still, his hand on his sword hilt but not drawing the blade, feeling the cool scales against his body, the serpent's breathing synchronized with his own. After a moment, he carefully continued forward, with Fretch following close behind, both warriors amazed by what had just occurred. With the serpent neutralized, the assault on the fortress was swift and brutal. They cut through any resistance they encountered, freed Fretch's wife and sons from their captivity, and drove the cattle before them. They also took whatever treasures they could carry, for these were the spoils of war and they had earned them. As they prepared to leave, Conall removed the serpent from his belt and released it. The creature looked at him once more with those strange eyes, then slithered away into the darkness, leaving the warriors to wonder at the meaning of what had passed between them. The journey home was long but triumphant. They drove the cattle before them, retracing their steps across the continent, across the sea, through Britain and Alba, and finally back to Ireland's shores. Fretch was reunited with his family, his wealth was restored, and he had a tale to tell that would be remembered for generations. For Conall Cernach, the adventure had revealed something about his nature that perhaps even he had not fully understood. The serpent had recognized something in him, some quality that transcended ordinary warriorhood. Some scholars have suggested a connection to the ancient horned god Cernunnos, often depicted with serpents, noting the echo in the name Cernach. Whether this connection is real or imagined, the tale of the serpent belt has become one of the defining images of Conall's legend, a moment when the natural and supernatural worlds acknowledged him as something more than merely human. The combat at the ford. Among all of Conall Cernach's battles, his victory over Misgedra, King of Leinster, stands out not for its complexity or its scale, but for what it reveals about the code of honor that governed these ancient warriors. It was a battle born of poetry gone wrong, waged between two maimed champions, and ended in a way that would have consequences reaching far beyond the immediate participants. The proximate cause of the war between Ulster and Leinster was not a cattle raid or a border dispute, but the cruelty of a poet. His name was Athern, and he was renowned throughout Ireland not for the beauty of his verses but for his viciousness. In a culture that revered poets and gave them almost magical status, for a poet's satire could literally blemish a man's face or destroy his reputation. Athern was a weapon of mass destruction disguised in the robes of an artist. King Conchobar mac Nessa sent Athern on a circuit around Ireland to exact tribute from the other kingdoms, a task that the poet approached with malicious glee. When he came to Leinster and the hall of Misgedra, he demanded not merely gold or cattle, but increasingly personal and humiliating tributes. He took the king's wife Buan for a night, extracting a promise that she would go to whichever Ulsterman brought Misgedra's head. He took 150 wives of Leinster men with him, essentially kidnapping them. His demands were designed not just to enrich Ulster, but to provoke Leinster to war. And provoke them he did. The Leinster army gave pursuit, catching up with the Ulster force and engaging in a battle of terrible intensity. It was during this conflict that something happened to Misgedra that would define his final combat. At a place called the Path of Clane, away from the main battle, Misgedra was with only his gilly when a bizarre incident occurred. A giant nut, larger than a man's head, came floating down the stream. Misgedra retrieved it and cut it in half with his knife. His gilly, waking suddenly, claimed to have had a terrible prophetic vision and, in a panic, demanded to know if his portion of the nut had been saved. Without waiting for confirmation, thinking his king had taken both halves for himself, the gilly seized a weapon and struck at Misgedra, severing his hand at the wrist. When the gilly realized his horrible mistake, that his vision had been false or misinterpreted, and he had just maimed his own king, he was overcome with guilt and shame. He took his own life on the spot, leaving Misgedra alone, one-handed, his sword arm gone, trying to act as his own charioteer as he attempted to escape the battlefield. It was in this condition, wounded and alone, that Misgedra encountered Conall Cernach. Conall was seeking revenge for two of his brothers who had fallen in the earlier fighting, and when he saw the King of Leinster, injured and vulnerable, he might have struck him down easily and added another head to his collection. But Conall Cernach did not strike. Instead, looking at the one-handed king, he made a choice that speaks to the complicated honor code of these warriors. "I will fight you," he said, "but I will not take advantage of your wound. We will fight as equals." And with that, Conall tucked one of his own hands into his belt, effectively giving up the use of it, making himself one-handed like his opponent. Then they fought, blade to blade, strength to strength, skill against skill, each man knowing that only one would leave this place alive. The combat was fierce and relatively brief. Despite his injury, despite acting as his own charioteer, Misgedra was still a king and a warrior of considerable skill. But Conall was Conall Cernach, the victorious, the man marked by prophecy and shaped by constant warfare. His blade found its mark, and Misgedra fell, his blood darkening the Irish earth. Conall took the king's head as was his custom, but he did something else with it as well. He placed the head on his own shoulder, and as he did so, something remarkable happened. The weight of the head, or perhaps some residual magic in it, or perhaps simply the will of fate, straightened Conall's neck. The crook that had marked him since birth, the physical reminder of Cet's attempted murder, was healed by the trophy of this victory. It was as if Ms. Gedra's death had paid some debt, had balanced some cosmic account, and Conall's body reflected that balance. But Conall's charioteer, looking at the head, found he could not carry it. The weight was too great, or perhaps the head held too much power for an ordinary man to bear. So Conall, ever practical, cut out the brain. He preserved it by mixing it with lime, a process that calcified it into a hard ball, a gruesome trophy but one that could be easily transported and displayed. This calcified brain would become, in a strange twist of fate, an instrument of revenge that Ms. Gedra could never have planned. Years later, Cet Macmagach would steal this preserved brain. He would make from it a projectile, and with this macabre ammunition, he would kill King Conchobar Mac Nessa himself, driving the calcified brain into the king's skull where it would lodge, causing his death 7 years later. Thus, Ms. Gedra would avenge his own death in a way that none could have foreseen, his preserved brain becoming a weapon wielded by Conall's own uncle against Conall's own king. But on that day at the Path of Clane, none of this future was known. Conall Cernach stood victorious, his neck straightened, his honor intact, having shown both mercy in fighting one-handed and ruthlessness in taking his opponent's life and head. It was the kind of paradox that defined him, a man capable of great honor and great violence, often in the same moment, never quite fitting into simple categories of hero or villain, but always victorious. The Oath Brothers. There are few bonds more sacred in Irish mythology than that of the Foster brothers, the warriors raised together, trained together, bound by oaths that go deeper than blood. For Conall Cernach, that bond was embodied in his relationship with Cúl Chulainn, the greatest hero Ireland would ever know. Though we have seen Conall sometimes in Cúl Chulainn's shadow, competing for champions' portions and honor, the truth is that their relationship transcended rivalry. They were brothers in the deepest sense, and they had made an oath to each other that would define the latter part of Conall's life. The oath was simple and absolute. Whichever of them died first, the other would avenge him before the sun set on that same day. It was the kind of vow that young warriors make in the flush of their strength, never quite believing that death will actually come for them, never imagining the weight of such a promise. But both Conall and Cúl Chulainn knew that death came for all warriors eventually, and when they spoke this oath, they meant every word. When Cúl Chulainn's death finally came, it came in a way that seemed impossible for such a mighty warrior. He had been lured into a trap by Maeve of Connaught, who had conspired with Lugaid mac Conry, Usi mac Cairpra, and the sons of Calatin, all men with reasons to hate the Hound of Ulster. They used sorcery and treachery, forcing Cúl Chulainn to break his Gisa, his sacred taboos, spiritually weakening him before the fight even began. The battle was desperate and unequal. Lugaid had 3 magical spears, each prophesied to kill a king. With the first, he killed Laig, Cúl Chulainn's charioteer, king of charioteers. With the second, he killed Liath Mocha, Cúl Chulainn's horse, king of horses. With the third, he mortally wounded Cúl Chulainn himself. Rather than fall, Cúl Chulainn tied himself to a standing stone so that he might die on his feet, facing his enemies, defiant to the last breath. His foes, fearful even of his dying fury, would not approach until the Morrigan, the goddess of war, landed on his shoulder in the form of a crow, the final sign that the great hero's spirit had departed. Lugaid approached then and cut off Cúl Chulainn's head, but even in death, the hero was not finished. As the head was severed, the sword fell from Cúl Chulainn's dead hand and struck Lugaid, cutting off his hand in return. It was as if even deceased, Cúl Chulainn's body knew that vengeance must be taken. Word of Cúl Chulainn's death spread across Ulster like wildfire, and it reached Conall Cernach with the force of a physical blow. His foster brother, his companion since childhood, the greatest warrior Ireland had ever known, was dead. And Conall knew, with the certainty of an oath sworn and never forgotten, what he had to do. He armed himself immediately, taking up his weapons, preparing his chariot. There was no time for elaborate mourning, no time for the traditional rites and lamentations. The sun was already climbing toward its zenith, and Conall had sworn to take vengeance before that sun set. He had hours, not days, to find Cúl Chulain's killers and make them pay in blood for what they had done. Conall's horse, Dig en Druchteg, the dewy red or dripping red, seemed to sense the urgency and the rage of its master. The animal led Conall directly to where Cúl Chulain's body still stood, tied to its standing stone, a sight that would haunt Conall for the rest of his days. He allowed himself only a moment to look upon his foster brother's corpse before wheeling his horse around and taking up the pursuit of the killers. He found them at the River Liffey, Lugaid mac Conry and Osi mac Kepra, still fleeing, still hoping to escape Ulster's wrath. When they saw Conall approaching, his face set like stone, his weapons gleaming in the afternoon light, they knew that death had found them. Lugaid, seeing Conall, made a desperate appeal to the warrior code they all shared. He held up his stump where his hand had been, showing the wound that Cúl Chulain's falling sword had inflicted. "Look," he said, "I have already been maimed in this fight. Your foster brother took my hand even in death. Surely this is wound enough. Surely we can call this even." But Conall's heart was iron, and his purpose was fixed. "I will give you the same courtesy I gave to Ms. Gedra," he said coldly. "We will fight as equals." And he tucked his own hand into his belt, making himself one-handed as Lugaid was one-handed, honoring the code even in the midst of his rage. They fought through the afternoon, blade against blade, skill against skill, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. Lugaid was a formidable warrior, son of the great Cúri, and even with one hand, he was nearly Conall's match. The fight went on, the sun creeping toward the western horizon, and Conall felt time slipping away. If he did not kill Lugaid before sunset, he would have failed his oath, would have broken the sacred promise made to his foster brother. Then Dig en Druchteg, Conall's loyal horse, acted on its own initiative. The animal, seeing its master struggling, seeing the sun sinking lower, leaned forward and took a great bite out of Lugaid's side, tearing away flesh and muscle, creating a wound that unbalanced and weakened him. It was the opening Conall needed. His blade found Lugaid's neck, and the head fell, adding one more to Conall's long tally. He pursued Ursi as well, cutting him down without mercy, taking his head too. 2 heads for 1 life. It was not enough, could never be enough, but it was what honor demanded. When Conall brought Ursi's head back to Tara to display it, Ursi's sister Acall was there. She saw her brother's head in Conall's hand, saw the blood still fresh on it, and the grief that struck her was so profound that her heart simply stopped. She died on the spot, another casualty of the vengeance cycle that seemed to have no end. For Conall Cernach, the vengeance was complete, but the victory was hollow. He had kept his oath. He had avenged his foster brother before the sun set on the day of his death. But Cúl Chulainn was still gone, and the world felt emptier for his absence. The greatest warrior of Ulster was dead, and while Conall could claim many victories, could point to many heads taken and many battles won, he knew that he would always be measured against Cúl Chulain's legacy, would always be the second champion, the one who came after. But he had kept his word, and in a world where oaths were sacred and honor was more precious than life itself, that meant everything. The final duel with Cet. Every warrior has a nemesis, a rival whose existence defines and sharpens him, whose name is forever linked with his own in the annals of legend. For Conall Cernach, that nemesis was Cet mac Magach, the uncle who had tried to murder him in infancy, the Connacht champion whose boasting he had defeated at Mac Da Thoas feast, the man whose brother's head he had thrown onto the table in that famous confrontation. Their rivalry had been brewing since Conall's first breath, had been present in every battle between Ulster and Connaught, had coloured countless encounters over the decades. It could only end one way, and both men knew it. The final chapter of their feud began when Cet led a raid into Ulster, as he had done countless times before. But this raid was particularly brutal. Cet and his warriors killed 27 Ulstermen and took their heads as trophies, a deliberate insult to Ulster and to Conall in particular. It was as if Cet was declaring that he too could be a collector of heads, that he too could be victorious, that the prophecy that had marked Conall as the doom of Connaught was not infallible. When news of the raid reached Conall, he immediately took up his weapons and set out in pursuit. But fortune smiled on him in an unexpected way. It had snowed. The tracks of Cet and his party were clear as day in the white blanket that covered the ground, a trail of footprints and hoofprints and blood drops leading away from Ulster toward the Connaught border. Conall followed that trail with grim determination, his chariot cutting through the snow, his eyes fixed on the tracks ahead. He knew where they would lead. He knew this confrontation had been building for his entire life, had been set in motion the moment Cet's heel descended toward an infant's neck and failed to break it entirely. This was destiny and vengeance and prophecy all converging at a single point. But as he drew closer to his prey, as the distance narrowed and the moment of confrontation approached, something unexpected happened. Conall Cernach, who had faced giants and serpents, who had fought across the breadth of Ireland and beyond, who had never shown fear in battle, felt doubt creeping into his heart. This was not just another enemy. This was Cet Mac Magach, the champion of Connaught, the warrior who had humiliated so many Ulster heroes at Mac Da's feast, the man who had tried to kill Conall when he was helpless and unable to fight back. The doubt must have shown on his face or in his bearing, because his charioteer, that loyal companion whose name has not survived in the tales but whose action changed everything, turned to him and spoke words that cut deeper than any blade. "Are you afraid?" the charioteer asked simply, his voice carrying no judgment, only genuine question. The words struck Conall like a physical blow. To be accused of cowardice, even by a gentle question from a loyal companion, was unbearable. The shame of it burned away the doubt, hardened the resolve, reminded him of who and what he was. He was Conall Cernach, the victorious. He was the fulfillment of prophecy, the one marked from birth to be the doom of Connaught. Fear had no place in his heart. "Drive on," he commanded, his voice steady again, and the chariot surged forward through the snow. They caught up with Cet at a ford, one of those shallow crossings that dot Irish rivers, where the water runs swift but not too deep, where warriors have met in single combat since time beyond memory. Cet was ready for him. Perhaps he had known, even as he fled, that Conall would follow. Perhaps he had wanted this confrontation as much as Conall had. Perhaps he saw it as the inevitable culmination of the path set when he had failed to kill his nephew in infancy. The two warriors faced each other across the water, uncle and nephew, Connaught and Ulster, two champions at the peak of their powers, each carrying decades of victories and defeats, grudges and grievances. No words were spoken. What was there to say that had not already been said at Mac Da's feast? What insult or boast could add anything to the weight of history between them? They charged. The battle that followed was ferocious beyond description. These were not young warriors fighting their first duel, trading cautious blows and testing defenses. These were veteran champions, each intimately familiar with the art of killing, each bearing scars from 100 battles, each determined to be the one who walked away from this ford. Blade met blade with the sound of thunder. Shields splintered under the force of blows. The snow around them turned red with blood, though whose blood it was impossible to say, for both men were wounded again and again, each injury adding to the frenzy rather than slowing them down. Conall fought with all the skill he had accumulated over his long career, with all the strength prophecy had given him, with all the rage that came from being nearly murdered as an infant. Cet fought with equal fury, with the pride of Connacht behind every blow, with the determination of a man who knows he is the last line of defense against prophecy itself. Hours passed, though to the combatants it might have been moments or days. The sun moved across the sky. The ford ran red. And finally, inevitably, Conall's blade found its mark one final time. Cet Mac Magach, champion of Connacht, fell into the icy water, his blood mingling with the stream, his eyes dimming as life left them. Conall stood over his fallen uncle, gasping for breath, bleeding from a dozen wounds, barely able to stand himself. He had won. The prophecy was fulfilled one more time. Another Connachtman had fallen to his blade. But the victory felt nothing like triumph. He was wounded nearly to death himself, barely conscious, surrounded by unfriendly territory, his strength almost entirely spent. He took Cet's head, as was his custom, but he could go no further. His wounds were too severe, his strength too depleted. He collapsed in the snow, bleeding and barely breathing, certain that he had won his final victory and that it would cost him his life. He was found there by Belchu of Brafen, a Connachtman who came upon this Ulster warrior lying in the snow with his uncle's head beside him. By all rights, Belchu should have finished the job, should have taken Conall's head and avenged Cet. But Belchu was an honourable man, and he looked at the wounded champion and made a different choice. He took Conall to his own home, tended his wounds, gave him shelter and food and rest. He allowed Conall to recover his strength, intending, perhaps, to fight him properly once he was well enough to defend himself. It was the kind of strange honour that marked these ancient warriors, the ability to be enemies and yet to recognise something worthy in each other. But as Conall recovered and his strength returned, Belchu began to regret his honourable choice. This was Conall Cernach in his home, the doom of Connacht, the man who had just killed one of Connacht's greatest champions. Gratitude and hospitality warred with pragmatism and survival, and pragmatism won. Belchu decided that he could not face Conall in fair combat, for he knew he would lose. Instead, he went to his 3 sons and told them to creep into Conall's sickbed while he slept and kill him there, weaponless and vulnerable. It was dishonourable, cowardly, but it was practical. Sometimes, Belchu reasoned, honour must give way to necessity. But Conall, even wounded, even in an enemy's home, was not so easily caught off guard. He overheard the plot. Perhaps his years of constant vigilance had trained him to sleep lightly, or perhaps some god whispered a warning in his dreams. Whatever the reason, when night fell and Belchu's sons crept toward the bed where they thought Conall slept, they found instead their own father. Conall had forced Belchu into his own sickbed, had made him take the place where the murder was meant to happen. The sons, seeing only a form beneath the blankets, struck without checking, without confirming, and they killed their own father in the darkness. When they realized what they had done, there was no time for grief or horror. Conall was upon them, his wounds not fully healed but his strength sufficient to the task. He killed all 3 of them in quick succession, adding their heads to the tally. 4 heads he took from that house, Cet's from the ford, and now Belchu's and his 3 sons from this night's work. With these gruesome trophies in hand, Conall finally made his way back to Ulster, his wounds slowly healing, his body marked with new scars to add to the collection accumulated over a lifetime of warfare. He had faced his uncle in the final confrontation their long feud had always promised, and he had emerged victorious, though barely. The prophecy spoken at his birth continued to be fulfilled. He had killed more than half of Connacht's warriors. He never spent a night without a Connachtman's head on his belt. He was, truly and completely, Conall Cernach, the victorious. The autumn years. Even the mightiest warriors grow old. The sword arm that once seemed tireless begins to ache. The eyes that could spot an enemy at incredible distances begin to dim. The body that weathered countless wounds begins to betray its owner in ways both small and large. For Conall Cernach, the warrior who had seemed invincible in his prime, age came not as a gentle friend, but as a cruel adversary he could not defeat. After the death of Conall Cernach, after the killing of Cet, after so many battles and so many heads taken, Conall found himself in a world that had changed around him. King Conall mac Nessa, the uncle or cousin who had ruled Ulster throughout Conall's adult life, was dead, killed by the very brain of Misgedra that Conall himself had preserved and that Cet had stolen to use as a weapon. Conall's son Cormac Condominium Longers had briefly taken the throne, but had also died soon after. The kingship of Ulster was offered to Conall himself. It was recognition of his long service, his countless victories, his status as Ulster's premier surviving champion. But Conall refused the crown. Perhaps he felt too old to take on such responsibility. Perhaps he understood that being a king required different skills than being a warrior, and that what made him great in battle would not necessarily make him great in governance. Or perhaps he was simply tired, bone-weary from a lifetime of violence, and wanted rest rather than more responsibility. Instead, he suggested that Cusgrade Men Mocha, Conall's younger son, should take the throne. But the suggestion was not accepted, and Conall withdrew from the politics of Ulster, feeling increasingly isolated and useless. In his later years, Conall contracted leprosy, that terrible wasting disease that eats away at the flesh and marks its victims as unclean. For a warrior who had always been defined by his physical prowess, by his strength and skill, the disease must have been particularly cruel. His hands, which had wielded sword and spear with such deadly precision, became marked and weakened. His face, which had been described as fair despite its unusual coloring, became ravaged by the disease. But beyond the physical symptoms was the isolation. Lepers were segregated from society, feared and avoided. For a man who had lived his entire life in the company of warriors, who had fought side by side with the greatest heroes of his age, this isolation was perhaps a worse affliction than the disease itself. In his need and his sickness, Conall turned to an unexpected quarter for help. He went to Cruachan, the seat of Connacht's power, to the court of Queen Maeve and her husband Ailill. It was a strange choice, to seek aid from the very kingdom he had been prophesied to destroy, from the people whose warriors he had killed by the score. But Ailill and Maeve had the resources to care for him. Their wealth was legendary, and more importantly, Conall's appetite had become enormous. The disease or something else had made him always hungry, requiring quantities of food that would have bankrupted a lesser household. Maeve and Ailill took him in, whether out of respect for a worthy enemy, out of genuine compassion, or out of some political calculation we can only guess. They provided for him, fed him, gave him shelter. For a time, the warrior who had been Connacht's doom lived peacefully in Connacht's capital, an old man seeking nothing more than comfort in his final years. But peace was not to be Conall Cernach's fate. Ailill, despite being married to the formidable Maeve, had been carrying on an affair with another woman. When Maeve discovered this betrayal, her rage was volcanic. She could have killed Ailill herself, but she chose a more poetic form of vengeance. She went to Conall and reminded him of an old debt. Years before, Ailill had killed Fergus mac Roich, one of Ulster's greatest heroes and one of Conall's closest friends. It was an old wound, one that Conall had perhaps thought healed or at least forgotten in the passage of time. But Maeve, with her cunning words, reopened that wound. She reminded him of his duty, of the oath that warriors take to avenge their friends, of the fact that Fergus's death had never been properly answered. And Conall, old and sick as he was, felt the old fire kindle once more. He was Conall Cernach, who had never left an oath unfulfilled, who had never failed to take vengeance. Age and disease might have weakened his body, but they had not changed what he was at his core. On the 1st of May, on the ancient festival of Beltane, Conall killed Ailill. How he managed it, whether through stealth or through the remnants of his warrior skill, the tales do not detail. But the deed was done, and immediately, Conall knew he had to flee. He was in the heart of Connaught, surrounded by Ailill's warriors and kinsmen, and though Maeve had incited him to murder, she would not protect him from the consequences. Conall fled Cruachan, his old legs carrying him as fast as they could, heading for the border with Ulster, heading for safety. But he was pursued. The warriors of Connaught, enraged by their king's death, hungry for vengeance against this man who had killed so many of them over his long life, came after him like hounds after a stag. Among the pursuers were 3 warriors known as the Red Wolves of Mertine, fierce fighters who had long sought a chance to bring down the great Conall Cernach. They tracked him across Mag Luag, through the lands of Braefn, pushing him ever further from safety, wearing down his strength, waiting for the moment when age and exhaustion would make him vulnerable. That moment came at a ford, a place called Athene Minna or Athene Miana, near the Plain of Adoration in Braefn. It was Monday, the 7th of May, 6 days after he had killed Ailill. Conall could run no further. His strength, which had seemed inexhaustible in his youth, was finally spent. He turned to face his pursuers, sword in hand one final time, determined to die as he had lived, as a warrior, standing and fighting, never surrendering. The 3 red wolves fell upon him at the ford. The battle was short and brutal. Conall, sick and exhausted and old, could not stand against 3 fresh warriors. They cut him down, and when he fell into the ford's cold water, they took his head, the final trophy in a life defined by the taking of heads. The place where he fell would be called Bil Atha Canail, the mouth of Conall's ford, and would later become the town of Ballyconnell in County Cavan. Even in death, Conall Cernach left his mark on the land, his name carried forward by the place where he made his final stand. His head was carried south, back to Connaught, displayed as proof that the man who had been prophesied to destroy half of Connaught had finally been destroyed himself. The doom of Connaught was dead, killed by Connachtmen, the prophecy both fulfilled and undone in the same long life. The legacy of the victorious. When we look back across the span of Conall Cernach's life, from the Druid's well where his mother drank enchanted water, through the feast halls where he competed for glory, across battlefields soaked in blood, to the ford where he made his final stand, we see a figure of profound complexity. He was not the greatest warrior of his age. That honor belonged to Cúl Chulainn. He was not the wisest counselor or the most honorable knight. But he was something perhaps more interesting. He was persistently, determinedly, relentlessly victorious. The epithet Cernach that defines him is itself ambiguous. The ancient Irish scholars struggled to explain it, offering multiple interpretations. Victorious or triumphant was the preferred translation, the one that seemed to fit best with his character and deeds. But other meanings were suggested. Angular, having corners, referring perhaps to his crooked neck or to the sharp edges of his personality. Swollen, which might reference the lump on his head described in some sources, the physical manifestation of Cet's failed murder attempt. Some even suggested possessing a dish or receptacle, though this meaning seems more obscure. This ambiguity in his very name reflects the ambiguity in his nature. He was a man of honor who fought one-handed against one-handed opponents to ensure fairness. He was also a man who collected heads with such dedication that he never spent a night without a Connachtman's head under his knee. He was capable of great loyalty, keeping his oath to avenge Cúl Chulainn before sunset. He was also capable of accepting Bricrew's challenge and then fleeing rather than keeping his word when the cost became clear. In the manuscripts and tales that have come down to us, Conall appears in a remarkable number of stories. He is present in the Tyne Bo Cuailnge, the great cattle raid that stands at the center of the Ulster cycle, though his role there is diminished, suffering the same magical weakness that afflicted all the warriors of Ulster except Cúl Chulainn. He appears in Sela Muxmaic Da though, where he claims the champion's portion in one of mythology's most dramatic moments. He appears in Fled Brickren, where he fails to claim that same portion. He appears in Tynebo Frach, journeying to the Alps. He appears in the destruction of Da Durga's hostel, one of the last warriors standing. The list goes on and on. This persistence in the tradition suggests that the medieval Irish audiences considered Conall important. He was not relegated to the sidelines or forgotten in favour of more glamorous heroes. Instead, he appeared again and again, his character remarkably consistent across centuries of retellings. He is always the collector of heads, always associated with horses, always feuding with Cet, always serving as a guardian to others, and in his later tales, always aging and seeking an honourable death. Some scholars have suggested connections between Conall Cernach and the ancient Celtic horned god Cernunnos. The similarity in names is striking, and certain elements of Conall's mythology, particularly the episode with the serpent that wrapped around his waist like a belt, echo the iconography of Cernunnos, who is often depicted with serpents. The horned god was associated with fertility, abundance, animals, and the underworld. If Conall Cernach was indeed a euhemerized version of this deity, it would explain the power and persistence of his character in the tradition. Unusually for a character from the Ulster cycle, Conall appears in medieval Irish genealogies as the ancestor of real historical dynasties. The kings of the Dal Enaradi and the Ui Echak Kobo claimed descent from him, as did the legendary High King Malmac Rockride. This suggests that Conall's importance extended beyond the purely literary or mythological into the realm of political legitimacy and dynastic claims. In modern Irish folklore, Conall's story continued to be told and evolved. He was sometimes conflated with members of the Fianna, the war band led by Fionn McCool, despite being from a completely different cycle of mythology. The town of Ballyconal continues to claim the story of his death as part of its heritage, keeping alive the memory of the ford where the great warrior fell. What, then, are we to make of Conall Cernach? He represents something essential about the warrior culture of ancient Ireland: the obsession with honour and reputation, the importance of keeping oaths, the practice of taking heads as trophies, the complex web of kinship and fosterage that bound heroes together even across provincial boundaries. He also represents the more uncomfortable realities of that culture, the endless cycle of vengeance, the way violence begets more violence, the fact that even great warriors grow old and sick and weak, that even victorious lives can end in defeat. His story reminds us that not every hero is the greatest hero. Sometimes the most interesting figures are those who stand in the shadow of greatness, who come in second, who are defined as much by what they are not as by what they are. Conall was not Cúl Chulainn. He could not match his foster brother's supernatural battle frenzy, could not claim to be the son of a god, could not stand alone against entire armies. But what he could do, what he did do, was keep fighting, keep winning, keep fulfilling the prophecy that had been spoken at his birth. He was Conall Cernach, the victorious, the man with the crooked neck who never spent a night without a Connachtman's head under his knee, who fought across the breadth of Europe and back again, who avenged his foster brother before sunset, who faced his uncle in a final duel at a ford, who grew old and sick but never surrendered his warrior's pride, who died as he had lived, fighting. His story has echoed down through the centuries, preserved in manuscripts copied and recopied by monks who might not have approved of his violent ways but understood that he represented something essential about Irish identity and history. Every time someone tells the story of Mac Da Thoas feast, every time the tale of the serpent belt is recounted, every time a child in Ballyconal hears about the ford where a great warrior fell, Conall Cernach lives again. Closing. And so we come to the end of our journey with Conall Cernach, the warrior marked from birth, victorious in life, and defeated only by time and treachery in death. We have walked with him from the magical well where his mother drank enchanted water, through the feast halls and battlefields that defined his life, to the ford in County Cavan where he made his final stand. His story reminds us of truths that the ancient Irish understood deeply, that destiny is not escaped, that oaths must be kept regardless of cost, that honor and violence are often inseparable, and that even the mightiest warriors are, in the end, only human. The prophecy spoken at his birth came true in ways both literal and unexpected. He was indeed terrible to his mother's family, indeed killed more than half the men of Connaught, indeed never spent a night without a Connachtman's head on his belt. But he was also capable of friendship and loyalty, of mercy and honor, of choosing fairness even in combat. As you prepare to leave this story and return to your own world, perhaps you'll carry with you something of Conall Cernach's persistence, his determination to be victorious even when circumstances seem to guarantee defeat. Perhaps you'll remember the importance of keeping oaths and honoring friendships. Or perhaps you'll simply remember that in the rich tradition of Irish mythology, even those who stand in the shadow of greater heroes have stories worth telling, lives worth examining, and lessons worth learning. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Conall Cernach. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of Ireland's most fascinating warriors, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video. Your support allows us to continue delving into these ancient stories, bringing to life the heroes and gods and magical beings who populate Irish mythology. Until next time, may your own path be victorious, and may the stories of old continue to speak to you in the quiet hours of the night. Sleep well, dear travelers, and dream of heroes.